13 in our program of the modern novel. Today I will be talking to you about the themes in Heart of Darkness, some of the themes in Heart of Darkness. We talked in our last lecture about the events and of the story and Marlowe's travel from England to Belgium and from Belgium to the river Congo in Africa, and from there his mission to go and retract Kurtz, the commander of the inner station. So he goes from the outer station to the middle station to the inner station, and we talked about the events of that journey. Perhaps the central theme in Heart of Darkness is colonialism and imperialism. There are many other themes, but I think the central theme in the story is colonialism and imperialism. And you would have to remember that when we talked about the origins of the novel, that also colonialism was one of the main reasons for the appearance of the novel. You remember Robinson Crusoe started going on his sea travels to explore new colonies, and he established himself as a plantation owner and a slave trader and so on. And none of this would have happened without colonial expansions, and we saw how the theme of colonialism is strongly present in Robinson Crusoe. His relationship with Friday, his relationship with the natives in the deserted island. These are all themes that show that colonialism was a strong reason for the appearance of the novel, and it remained a strong theme in the novel from its beginning until the early 20th century, as we see today with Heart of Darkness. So when Marlowe, so colonialism and imperialism is a central theme in Heart of Darkness. When Marlowe sets off on his adventure from Brussels, the colonization of the Congo is presented as a humanitarian project whose purpose is to help the Africans, to help them live in the modern world, to help them educate themselves, to help them acquire technology. You remember that in the beginning of the novel, these are the ideas that are presented to us. These are the ideas that Marlowe's aunt tells him when she gets him a job in the company. She tells him that she's proud of him, that he's going to help enlighten those savages. So the common perception in Europe when Marlowe is leaving Europe for Africa is that colonization is a humanitarian effort that helps Africans improve their life conditions and acquire science and technology and education and so on. As Marlowe travels from Belgium to the Congo, and as he travels from the outer station to the central station to the inner station, this perception changes, and it changes dramatically. It changes almost 360 degrees. And finally, Marlowe encounters, throughout his journey, he encounters scenes of torture, of cruelty, of forced labor for the Africans, of large-scale exploitation, and also mass murder. So the idea of colonization being a humanitarian effort is completely shattered in Marlowe's voyage. And in fact, this is what one of the reasons for the title of the book as Heart of Darkness. I mean, Marlowe set himself to go on a voyage to get enlightened, to help in spread enlightened civilization to Africa. You notice even at the beginning of the novel, there is sunset and it's beautiful and there is lights, but by the end of the novel, when we go back to the Nelly, where the 5 gentlemen are sitting and discussing, it is already dark and gloomy and brooding. And you see this transformation from light to darkness, from a pretense to civilization to complete savagery and horror. And we see also Kurtz's last words, which were the horror, the horror. So all of these explain to us the change in Marlowe's perception from when he sets off in Europe to when he throughout his journey in Africa, and how this perception completely changes. The novel exposes the hypocrisy of colonialism and imperialism. The men who work for the company describe what they do as trade, right? When Marlowe travels from the outer station to the inner station, the Europeans that he meets and talks to, they describe what they do as trade, right? Trade. And their treatment of the native Africans, they say, is part of a benevolent, well-meaning project of civilization. But the reality is completely different. What Marlowe sees is extreme cruelty and exploitation and mass murder. And the word trade does not capture what the Europeans are doing in Africa. The Europeans are doing large-scale exploitation of the natural resources, and they're doing it by forcing the Africans to work without wages, without paying them. Remember that King Leopold made it a law. It was a law that no one should pay Africans for their work. So in part 1, in section 4 of part 1 of the novel, we have this amazing sentence, this very powerful sentence, where Marlowe says the word ivory, ivory that they are digging and, you know, cutting from the parts of the elephants. The word ivory rang in the air. It was whispered and sighed, whispered and sighed. You would think they were praying to it, he says. You would think they were praying to it, right? Like ivory has become a god for these Europeans. Wealth, money. They've become worshippers of ivory. They'll do anything for it. They'll kill 100 Africans. They'll kill 1 million Africans. They'll kill millions of Africans to get the ivory because it means money and wealth for them. Attained, so he says the word ivory rang in the air, was whispered, was sighed. You would think they were praying to it. A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all. A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all, like a whiff from some corpse. By Jove, I've never seen anything so unreal in my life. So a sentence like this tells you how shocked Marlowe was, how shocked to the bone he was to see this extreme rapacity, this form of like imbecile rapacity. And he describes the practice as a whiff from some corpse, like there is a dying corpse, and you know, he's smelling the bad smell from a decomposing corpse, and these Europeans are feeding on it. This explains to you the extent to which the novel, Joseph Conrad and Marlowe, were shocked at the practices of colonialism. In 1901, when the novel was published, the practices of King Leopold in the Congo were just being known, right? The first newspaper reports were being published about the horrors of the Congo. So this shows you that someone who's been there and saw for themselves has had the shock of their lives, like Joseph Conrad, who came back and wrote his novel. We also have the relationship between Kurtz and the company. The novel sets the hypocrisy of the company and the Europeans in general. He sets against them the model of Kurtz. And Marlowe and Joseph Conrad, through him, in the end, prefer Kurtz's honesty to the company and the Europeans' hypocrisy. Kurtz, at least the novel tells us, is open about the fact that he does not trade. He doesn't say, like the Europeans, that he is there to trade. He says he's coming to take the ivory. He's coming to kill and take the ivory. He's coming to subjugate and enslave the Africans so they can give him the ivory. And this is a position of honesty, Marlowe tells us, and Joseph Conrad tells us. This honesty, at least, is better than the company's attitude of spreading mayhem and destruction and claiming that they are civilizing the Africans. So Marlowe is open about the fact that he does not trade, but rather takes ivory by force. And he describes his own treatment of the natives with the word suppression and extermination. He says, this is what I'm doing with the natives. I'm not here civilizing the natives. I'm here to suppress and exterminate the natives. He doesn't hide the fact that he rules through violence and intimidation. And unlike the other Europeans, Kurtz does not claim to be in Africa to help the Africans. He is frank about the fact that he is there to steal and plunder ivory. Kurt's perverse honesty, it's an honesty, but it's also a perverse honesty. It's an honesty that embraces extreme violence and torture and cruelty. Kurtz's perverse honesty leads to the success of the company because he brings them a lot of ivory, right? Because he doesn't mince his words, because he doesn't look for like nice words to describe what he's doing. He just goes and mass murders and takes ivory. So he brings a lot of ivory to the company. It's useful. His perverse honesty and immorality and cruelty is useful for the company because he brings them a lot of ivory, and they like that in the beginning. But eventually his honesty also brings his downfall, because his honesty exposes the evil practices behind European activity in Africa, and it exposes the company. This is why at some point Kurtz becomes a liability on the company, and they decide that they need to get rid of him because he shows them for what they really are, and they don't like that. It exposes them, and they decide to get rid of them. Also, another theme is the portrayal of the Africans. For Marlowe, for Kurtz, as well as for the company, the Africans are mostly objects. They're described as objects. Sometimes they're described as animals. Marlowe refers to his helmsman as a piece of machinery. He's just like a piece of machinery in the boat. And Kurt's African mistress, in the end, is described as a piece of statuary, like a decor, a piece of decoration. Africans are, throughout the novel, are described in zoological terms, in terms that are used to refer to animals. They're described as swarming. Well, it's ants and insects that swarm. They're described as ants, animals, insects, etc. And it can be argued that Heart of Darkness participates the novel, although it's a novel that exposes the excesses and the horrors of European colonialism, but the novel itself shows a lot of racist attitudes towards Africans. So the novel participates also in the dehumanization of the Africans. Notice, for example, that no African is allowed to speak in the novel. You don't see a single African speak. Africans make noises in the novel. They don't speak. Speech in Heart of Darkness is what Europeans do. Africans do not speak. They make noises and screams and savage things like that. Perhaps a very good passage to consider that describes how Heart of Darkness participates in the dehumanization of the Africans and their description as subhumans or non-humans is the passage where Marlowe says, "It was unearthly and the men were, well, he's talking about the African. It was unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not inhuman. There's a double negation here. They were not inhuman. So the European portrayed them as inhuman. They're not human. But he says they are not inhuman. So it means, well, are they human? It's like when you say this is not black. So does it mean it's white? Well, not necessarily. It could be brown, it could be yellow, it could be. So you can see how Marlowe says they're not inhuman. They're not inhuman. Does it mean they are human? Well, the novel isn't courageous enough to go that far and say they are. He says, no, they were not inhuman. Well, you know, that was the worst of it, and this describes to you the agony, how much agony Marlowe had, how much he struggled to recognize that the Africans are humans. If the suspicion of their not being inhuman, he says that was the worst of it. This suspicion that you have that, oh my God, they're not inhuman. They are human. So this is perhaps the biggest struggle that goes inside Marlowe's self. It would come slowly to one, he says. It would come slowly. What does? It's the suspicion that they're not inhuman. They howled. They howled. It's not humans who howl, it's wolves. Wolves howl and dogs, but humans don't howl. But he describes them in zoological terms, like he's in a zoo. He said they howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity. The thought, the idea that they're humans just like him scared him. The thought that he's just like these people who are brutalized and killed and mass murdered and exploited, the thought that he's just like them scares him. But they howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly, he says, ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages could comprehend. And why not, right? This is probably the most honest point Marlowe gets to in recognizing his kinship and his relationship to the Africans. So these are some of the themes of Heart of Darkness and some of the most important ideas that it discusses. First of all, we have the theme of colonialism and imperialism, and we see it through the treatment of, throughout Marlowe's journey. We see it in the treatment of white people, for example, throughout the novel. White people, Europeans, are presented as the most callous, as the most dishonest, as the most rapacious individuals that Marlowe deals with. Africans, also we've talked about the treatment of the Africans and how, although Marlowe feels uneasy and disturbed about the exploitation and the mass murders of the Africans, but he hesitates to recognize his kinship and his relationship with the Africans. These are some of the most important themes. I hope you enjoyed reading it, and I hope it will be useful in understanding it, and I will see you in our next and last lecture in this program. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh.